questions. Okay, so I am super pleased to introduce my friend Edward Sanabria, or as I call him and most everybody calls him, Ed. He is the Director of Behavior Analytics Services at the Speech Pathology Group and Rehab Services of Connecticut. He is also a doctoral student at the Chicago School. He's actually just getting started on his dissertation, specifically focusing on interdisciplinary collaboration. Is very relevant to what he's going to be talking about today, and also how you can apply behavior analysis to aquatics. Interestingly enough, and Ed will probably talk some about his history and stories that he can share throughout, but I also want to share that he's one of the few behavior analysts that's really focusing on how to leverage behavior science in aquatics to teach just individuals generally, but also specifically individuals that have autism or additional intellectual disabilities to be able to be safe and excel in the water. So that's super cool. He's one of the few in the country that are working on that. And one of the things that I also hope that you will find is what I've seen is how devoted he is to mentoring fellow behavior analysts and folks outside the field to see really what behavior analysis can offer, and that it really can help make the world a better place. And so thank you all for attending, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ed now, and please give him your full attention. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Lucas. Everyone, this is the right slide. Everyone can see the slideshow. We're good. All right. Thank you for that awesome introduction, Lucas. My name is Edward Sanabria. I am, as mentioned, in Connecticut. I'm all the way on the East Coast, and I have been. I was previously in the Boston area as a clinical director as well. And so I just wanted to thank you all for your attention for the next hour or so. My goal in this presentation is really to rejuvenate your passion for the science of behavior, bolster your excitement if you already have it, or validate your efforts within our field. Whenever I attend a talk or a webinar, I often feel like someone's trying to sell me a product. I always feel like, if it's a study, it's very dry, and I hope to be neither of those. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm only trying to present you things that I have found in the literature, things that I think make sense, things that hopefully make you think, and so that you can leave here not feeling empty-handed. I really hope to present you with something you can take home. Some of you might embrace it, some of you might dissect it, some of you might contemplate, or just outright learn something. That's really all I'm asking for, is to get those gears going. All right. So when we begin, let's get this moving. All right. So first, I like to start off with a quick story. I just want to lay a backdrop for where this presentation came from. Throughout the development of this presentation over the last year or so, I've been honored, like I mentioned, with the opportunity to help lead a couple organizations in their clinical efforts to provide quality and compassionate services. While I was doing this, I continue to hear about traditional services in our field, experiences. I've personally been now experiencing the pushback against ABA services from parents and other providers. And I've been helping to support staff, friends, and other BCBAs at other agencies experiencing various levels of burnout. And I wanted to make it my goal to provide a different type of approach as an agency, as a mission, a philosophy, and an approach. I wanted the staff to feel intuitive and confident and compassionate. I wanted the families to feel like they were heard. And so I took the hours of podcast listening. I do in-home services, so I'm in the car 10 hours a week, maybe 12 sometimes. And it's a lot of time to be sitting and contemplating and maybe listen to music. So I listen to podcasts. I read articles, or I listen to articles. And then I've been in school, so I've just been trying to synthesize all the information that I come across. And over the past 3 years, I started to notice a couple things. So one of the common themes I found is that I was focusing a lot of my supervision on not the clinical component of what the services were, but how the services were being provided. And I found that the what is very similar. The assessments are similar. The strategies are similar. We're all pretty familiar with the task list and those things, but it's really about the delivery of services and about how we're providing them. And through staff training and supervision, I found a similar pattern, spending time going on tangents, which is why, by the way, we are holding off questions until the end, because I'm known to go off on tangents if I'm answering them. And so I had started putting together these ideas into things that I thought were giving me the best return on investment. And I started pitching this approach as being outside the box. I was telling my staff and those around me that we were going to think outside the box. We were going to do things a little differently. We were going to shift our focus. So gladly, I was very happy to hear from other people that they thought the same thing. This, hearing things like, "Oh, I haven't seen it approached like this before. That's really creative," or "I like that perspective." Really getting the reinforcement I was looking for making this adjustment. And I started questioning. I was like, "Oh, what is it? What is it really specifically that we're doing? How do I help other people do something similar? How do we make this replicable?" And I was like, maybe I'm just super, super smart. Nah, probably not. Um, I didn't make it up myself. I come to find out. Um, but because I was able to take the time and go digging, I decided to go back in the literature and see how I can justify the things that I knew to be humane, compassionate, creative, and thoughtful. And I thought that those around me had different, that they had considered to be outside the box. And I was hoping that there would be some support for the things that I was doing, because we are supposed to be doing evidence-based practices after all. And so I took that time, I went and investigated, and I found some principles, some things that I held constant that I was saying all the time that were heavily influenced by my experiences, the mentors, my lessons that I had learned, and these serve as the foundation for today's presentation. Now, in this talk, I'm going to present 10 principles or statements that I find myself saying all the time. They're dense in their meaning and can all be dissected way beyond the reach of this presentation. While intentionally catchy, these have been helpful in the development of my own practices, my own decision making, and feedback and supervision. One of the things that I've noticed, Dr. Pat Freiman talks about how other fields will actually take our own strategies, package them better than we do, and then utilize them. And so here's my attempt at packaging what we have in our field and utilizing it to disseminate to those who also provide supervision and help others. For each of these rules, I'm going to aim to provide some evidence in our literature and discuss examples and applications across consumers and clients that we work with and who they can be applied for. Small note, I'm more than happy to share the references. The rest from here on out, it's going to be very reference heavy. And I did that on purpose because it's all available. I'm not making any of this up. It's been said for years. And so I'd be happy to share these references as we're going, so you don't have to feel like you're jotting things down if that's something you plan on doing. So let's start off with my first principle number 1. And this one is something you'll see consistently throughout, whether you're working with clients, with parents, with your significant other, with staff. You may be explaining about how you knew something were going to happen, or the staff are asking you to justify why you thought it was going to work. Or perhaps parents were just saying, maybe it's magic. Or maybe just behavior is behavior is behavior. All right. And so for this principle, I wanted to go back to B.F. Skinner and to our philosophical assumptions, including determinism, right? If we're to use methods of science, of science in the field of human affairs, we must assume behavior is lawful and determined, right? These things don't happen at random. We must expect to discover what a man does as a result of specifiable conditions, that once these conditions have been discovered, we can anticipate and to some extent determine his actions, right? Another one of the philosophical foundations that this is behavior is based off of is selection by consequence, right? And that behavior is a joint product of, 1, the contingencies of survival responsible for the natural selection of the species, right? Our natural selection. The contingencies of selection of reinforcement responsible for repertoires acquired by the members. And 3rd, the special contingencies maintained by an evolved social environment or your community, right? These principles of behavior, reinforcement, extinction, punishment, have all been supported and discovered through research and presented in numerous studies, right? Critchfield in 2014 also made similar points, where the organism is always right, or behavior is not personal, right? And it's not random. Behavior has a function. It's easiest to change when you know what's controlling it by understanding the historical and current environmental influences that led to the behavior of interest occurring, right? And for this audience, for the audience of this rule, it's important in the essence that it's reflected through the application across all audiences, all the organisms that we work with, whether it's people, all the people at different levels. They all may, to some degree, be a consumer behavior analysis by which we may apply our science to facilitate behavior change. Don't forget not to overthink analysis sometimes. We're presented with a ton of information, and it can easily lose sight of our approach, emotions, perspectives, etc. may all convolute our analysis. Often we get drifted from our most parsimonious decisions. All right. For the next principle, number 2, similar to 1, this one pops up all over the place. I found this that applies to times where we're working with families. Maybe our programs are plateauing. Maybe something's not working, or maybe you took the time to look at a bigger picture or include more antecedent to consequential variables, and come up with other ideas that others hadn't. And that is that behavior is a function of its context. This rule looks beyond our 3-term contingency and to the 4+ term contingency that we may in fact be dealing with. So we're going to go back to 1974. Gold-Diamond proposed a model that went beyond the 3-term contingency and included potentiating variables, essentially MOs or motivation, SDs and S deltas, abstractional and instructional stimuli, including the influence of control, similar to conditional stimuli, and stimulus prompts, potentially distractions or unrelated stimulus changes that affect behavior. So while this is not meant to be a lesson specific to this diagram, because there's a whole blue book about it, or blue books, my goal is just simply to emphasize the importance or existence of variables that may influence behavior well beyond the 3-term contingency that we've been trained to look for. All right. And to this point, Dr. Freiman, in his most recent TED Talk and his subsequent publication, both released earlier this year, refers to Dr. Flanagan's message there at Boys Town, where he says, there's no such thing as a bad boy. Only bad environments, bad teaching, bad modeling. In other words, bad circumstances. While I'm no Dr. Pat Freiman, I hope I can only do him justice by bringing him into the conversation. I think that this is in support of the perspective here, and on his way to talking about how we can be more compassionate as a field, he describes the influence that a circumstance or a situation or context has on how we respond to a person, how we approach a person. And with that, I tell my staff, I tell everyone, I assume you're missing something, right? Before you go and make a judgment, before you go and have an interaction, assume you're missing something. Try to look at the bigger picture. Remember that the behavior is a function of more than what you can just see in that moment, right? Go back to the drawing board if things aren't working, right? Open up the lens a little bit more, include more variables, look for patterns, right? Behavior occurs in a stream and it happens over time. We're looking for those patterns by incorporating more variables into our analysis. All right. For number 3, I found this to be relevant in 2 different contexts here. One where we must be aware of how we interact with each other and ways to be better at it. And the other in the development of clinical skill sets, that we can have ourselves or give to our supervisor, teach, where we may improve our approach and potentially be more effective in our efforts to develop therapeutic and professional relationships. All right. I really like this picture. Take a peek, look at it, really take it in. It really relates to the ultimate message of this principle. In this picture, we see how one object has, that screen, so I'm pointing it there. We have one object, and you can see from 3 different perspectives, none of them is actually more or less accurate than the other. They are simply different perspectives. And this is extremely important as it relates to our role as a professional who work with others, right? We use this next rule or principle as a reminder for our interactions, and that is that your perspective is true to you. And this generalizes to the people you're talking to, the others in your interaction. Their perspective is true to them. All right, let's open that one up a little bit. Let's dive in. So why might this be important? Jaris et al. In 2013 highlighted some of this main point when studying perspective taking. It has broadly been defined as the ability to interpret and predict the thoughts, emotions, or behaviors of oneself and of others, and associated with positive therapeutic outcomes as one of the foundations of a therapeutic relationship. When we make room to attempt to understand frameworks different from our own and try to emphasize this with others, we are in turn becoming better collaborators. I love here that he included oneself and the other, multiple perspectives in one interaction, right? So I believe that it is important, that an important component of one's ability to develop perspective taking skills that are clinically relevant starts with the perspective of oneself and focusing on the repertoires that will allow our perspective taking to help make us better decision makers for ourselves, our clients, and those we work with. So through my research, through my readings and listenings, I found a lot of literature that's been influential in my development of skill sets and how I provide supervision and what I teach in supervision. And I hope that it provides a framework for others to use. All right. I hope that you can, this will influence you the same way it did for myself. These are some of the main words that you'll see picked up across here. So I wanted to start with Leaf et al. In 2016. Applied behavior analysis is a science and therefore progressive. He describes a progressive approach to ABA where therapists can employ a structured yet flexible process, contingent upon and responsive to client progress. Through critical thinking, creative and flexible thinking, and being comfortable with science concepts and sensitivity to clients, we can create complex, dynamic, and effective interventions. Taylor, LeBlanc, and Nozick, 2019, in their article Compassionate Care and Behavior Analytic Treatment, outlines the important therapeutic relationship skills that should inform the repertoire of any practicing behavior analyst. Strategies to cultivate and enhance those skills and discuss the potential effects of relationship variables on treatment outcomes. After operationally defining compassion and its relation to perspective taking, the authors provide a framework and an outline for training and developing skills that reflect compassionate care. And similarly, Rohrer et al. In 2021 expanded on this concept, highlighting the improved outcomes and clinical adherence correlated with compassionate care and soft skills. They provide a tool that can be used in a number of ways as a means to improve compassionate, collaborative treatment by behavior analysts. All right, one of my favorite articles, Callahan et al., 2019, an article called Behavioral Artistry, examining the relationship between interpersonal skills and effective practice repertoires of applied behavior analysis practitioners. They looked at the practice repertoires as related to interpersonal skills outlined by Fox. And please note the type of characteristics and clinician behaviors that they're targeting here. All right. So one was likes people. Is just able to establish rapport, demonstrates concern, wants to facilitate positive change, has perceptive sensitivity, right? Being able to pay careful attention to the important indicators of client behavior that may be small, subtle, or gradual. Doesn't like to fail, sees difficult clients as a personal challenge to overcome and an opportunity for a client to succeed, be more independent, right? Has a sense of humor, recognizes and accepts that much in the educational and human services profession may be bizarre, may be illogical, or just outright humorous, right? Looks for the pony, is optimistic and sees behavior change in a glass half full context, always believing programming will be successful, and is therefore less likely to burn out. Is thick-skinned, doesn't take negative client actions towards themselves personally, maintains objectivity and positivity. And is self-actualized, does whatever is necessary and appropriate to facilitate and produce positive behavior change. Is not under the audience control and is creative. Right? Higher scores in the domains related to these characteristics were rated more positively in their delivery of ABA services. Notice, once again, we are not talking about the content of the service. More about the process, right? More about this in a minute. Another important aspect or characteristic that I think we should focus on is cultural humility. Wright in 2019 wrote an article focusing on this and how cultural humility incorporates a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and critique to address power imbalances and develop mutually beneficial, non-paternalistic partnerships with communities. It's very important. A very important idea emerges that a behavior analyst can never be competent in knowledge and understanding of every culture, but we may begin by cultivating a culture of practice that accepts that cultural biases affect treatment. We have a responsibility to engage in this self-reflection, assess our individual cultural biases, and the consequent influences on their behavior and the delivery of treatment. Given the uneven power dynamic inherent in the service delivery model, inspection and adjustments are necessary to ensure that optimal outcomes for the clients are not inhibited by our biases. I found it to be imperative that we, through the development of a humble behavioral repertoire, we should be developing these in pre-service and in-service trainings. The idea that cultural humility is never mastered and is an ongoing practice encouraged me to extend this to my practice and, in fact, look further into other humilities that we may have. I was thinking maybe clinical humility. What about clinical humility? Does that exist? So I was diving in and I couldn't find any extensions of this into clinical humility besides an article by Nuringer in 91, which I'll talk about a little later. But that focused on our language. So I did go outside of our field to find an article called Humility as a Psychotherapeutic Virtue. And here, Payne et al. Discusses the accurate self-assessment, recognition of limits, and regulation of self-centered emotions and the cultivation of other-centered emotions in a clinical setting. While cultural humility is understood as a commitment to a lifelong process of reflective consciousness, self-evaluation, and honesty regarding our cultural understanding, I believe that clinical humility is a similarly dynamic process and distinct from clinical competence. This does not mean that clinical competence, however, is somehow inferior. It's important to connect with the audience and be relatable by practicing this type of humility. I think this would be a fantastic research topic to look at, operationally defining clinical humility and then measuring its effects when trained in others. A final point and characteristic, and almost an obvious point for anyone that is looking to work with others, is collaboration. Here I've listed some articles that I find to be extremely relevant and important, two of which came out, one of them less than a month ago, and the other one a little earlier this year. And I've also included the Interprofessional Education Collaborative, as they have provided core competencies for interprofessional collaborative practice, which are more or less universal. These are for all professionals. And so they provide some core competencies to increase the effectiveness of our collaborative efforts. So by developing these repertoires, I think we put ourselves in a position to consider the other person and connect with, and on the other side. This will make it easier. If we hold true that we are products of our environment, then we must respect the learning histories of others and respect how they got there, whether or not we agree with it. We're not looking to place blame or point fingers, just support and help, right? Therefore, it is not our place to judge that, right? Remember to listen, demonstrate compassion, be respectful, and incorporate input and preference as much and whenever you possibly can. This brings up our first code word, which is an adverb, suspiciously. I'm not going to put it into a sentence because I didn't prepare those. But the adverb is suspiciously. Give me a second there. And we will push on. Number 4. All right. This one I use the most in supervision with parent training, IEPs, collaboration, and those questions on how you explain concepts to a parent or explain ABA to someone on an elevator. Or this definitely incorporates some perspective taking and talks about the next step. How do we communicate and what are we communicating? This principle is 80% presentation and 20% science. Is it a hyperbole? Perhaps. But let's explore a little more and find out. All right, so I'd like to go back to Skinner. In this book that many of us may know as verbal behavior, where he asserted that verbal behavior is only effective if it's reinforced by the listener. The audience, therefore, is critical to occasion certain responses, and we must therefore be able to adjust the language we use based on the audience we have. If we're not able to communicate in a way that has a desired effect, our effectiveness as a practitioner is hindered. Right? We can have the best intervention, best plan, best idea, best proposal, best program, the best anything. But if we're not able to communicate and present it in a way to get buy-in from our consumers, then it does not matter. After doing some digging, I was more than pleased to find out I wasn't the only person with this idea. We'll go back to 1980. Heinlein explored the jargon, vernacular, and the use of language and behavior analysis. He talks about the benefits and, most importantly, the limitations and its implications for our field. In 91, which was a very popular year for writing about this topic, Neuringer discussed the importance of language and presentation as it relates to humility as a clinician and a researcher. We must demonstrate a willingness to consider alternative views, support for diversity, openness to criticism, and in brief, a scientific stance that all knowledge is provisional and that one's most deeply held positions continually be reconsidered. More specifically, language as a behavior, instrumental behavior, is effective or not, and its effectiveness depends on our community. He emphasized that we omit our particular scientific language for a variety of reasons, but we must subject these reasons to the same scrutiny we do other subjects of our science. Right? In 91 as well, Bailey, in his discussion of marketing our science, discusses the need to address the relevant audience and ensure we're promoting their value to the person and the culture for the particular behavior change efforts. With powerful examples, he says, we need to stress not the demonstrated relationship between behavior and consequences, but rather how a student can become more independent, more mature, and self-confident as a result of using our technology. Rather than bringing up cause and effect relationships, we need to stress how behavioral procedures teach individual and group responsibility, build self-esteem, and encourage respect for others. Instead of trying to sell determinism, which I've already tried to do, we need to promote the view that behavioral technology gives children dignity and cultivates their freedom. We need to learn more about the needs of our consumers and be prepared to adapt our technology to suit them. All right, Lindsley in 91 highlighted the difference between a technology and a profession, where a technology may only have technical jargon, but a profession has both technical jargon and a set of plain English equivalents that we can use when translating our methods to the consumer, patients, or clients, right? The development of an accurate, comfortable application names may be one of the most important steps in moving from a technology to a profession. In 1996, Fox, in his article about behavior analysts as translators and ambassadors, talks about how we should be sensitive to how others react to and interpret our language because it's inextricably related to our image. What makes a good behavior analyst can be bad for public relation, and what is a blessing for a scientist can be a curse for a disseminator. Behavioral ambassadors and translators speak many languages and are sensitive to how others react and interpret what is being said. They must always consider their listeners' learning history and talk to them in their own language. We must evaluate what we're intending to say and the impact it might have on the listener before we speak. Our goal is to effectively translate our behavior analytic models to others. Most recently, Chadwell et al. In 2019 brought this point home with their study. It was to evaluate the value assigned to the therapeutic process by parents and caregivers seeking treatment for their children in both traditional and integrated primary care settings. The results of this showed that parents were willing to tolerate a treatment with significantly less empirical support in favor of numerous preferred therapist characteristics. I'm going to say that one more time. The results showed that parents were willing to tolerate a treatment with significantly less empirical support in favor of numerous preferred therapist characteristics. Right? The implications of this supports the message of this principle and these powerful articles. A field that prides itself on effectiveness must also evaluate the dissemination and integration of its message to primary care. right? In an application to our consumers, remember, we're looking for buy-in. What might that look like? Operationally define it, right? Is it agreement? Is it input? Are we looking for a conversation or engagement? Are we looking for body language? By operationally defining buy-in, we may then engage in practices that increase the probability that the other will engage in these behaviors. For clients, remembering to incorporate their preferences, provide lots of choices, and use Shapen to even out response effort. Using high probability sequences as well can be useful. Be flexible and enthusiastic. And with parents, incorporate their values, their preferences, cultures, and traditions. Be mindful of their resources and restrictions, right? Be compassionate and understanding. And because behavior is behavior, the similar things can be done with our staff. And this is next rule, number 5, relates more specifically to staff training. And I find this to be important when I'm training my staff or teaching other BCBAs to train their staff. And that is, train the process, not the procedure. This was an interesting one to dive into, as there's many relevant concepts that I found to be in line with the underlying message. The original intent was to train staff beyond the program sheet. Many of us come from a background where program binders are thick, graphing is done on paper and pencil, behavior support plans are long, and program sheets are aplenty. They each outline the specifics of a program, including directions, SDs, prompting, data collection, reinforcement system, targets, maintenance, and generalization. These procedures are supposed to provide detailed instruction on what it should look like, and the procedural integrity scores are based on all of these details. While this is inherently great for mass production of programming, high turnover or new staff, this inherently takes away from the potential benefits of more efficient programming. Providing the information related to outcomes, inconsequential details that may or may not be necessary, and performance-based decisions, as well as essential and non-essential components of a program and the contextual variables that we may encounter, may better help prepare staff to implement and teach children in more meaningful ways and across different contexts and environments. And also in a way that is more likely to increase safety, decrease rigidity, and increase generality. Let's look a little deeper. So, as defined by Webster, we look at a process. A process is a series of actions or operations conducing to an end. It's a continuous operation or a treatment. Notice the focus here is on outcomes and fluidity while satisfying the potential consumer. A procedure, on the other hand, could be a particular way of accomplishing something or of acting, a series of steps followed in a regular, definite order, or a traditional or established way of doing things. Notice that these satisfy a rule or an instruction, not an outcome. So how do we train a process? So I want to go back to the Gold, Diamond, and Lang, as I brought up earlier, and they talked about this as a form of stimulus control. If we look back at this diagram from earlier, we can then look at a very small part here. We're going to look at the abstractional and instructional stimuli. And I'll define those for you slowly, because it's a lot. Abstractional stimuli are a variable that's under control or that controls the behavior, producing reinforcement. It's a common rule for inclusion in a group, and it comes about during the course of behavior environment interactions. So abstractional stimuli come across during the interaction, and they're rules that we can identify through interaction. Instructional stimuli, we supply the rule in advance. The rules or instructional stimuli restrict response alternatives, as when we instruct our client to describe the changing object one way rather than another. They're discriminative stimuli that owe their effectiveness to the consequence attached to the behavior in their presence. So Lang further discussed abstractional control in the context of a therapeutic setting. Encouraging a change in abstractional control, whereby we establish a different way of responding to an event, we may transfer control from outside of our session, from those instructions and rules, to inside our sessions, right? The effectiveness of such transfer frequently depends on how patients respond to a therapist supplied stimuli, and in turn, how the therapist responds to the extractional control as it occurs. The therapist responds to the theme and not necessarily the precise words chosen. This leads us, or may play into what some may call performance-based decision or within trial adjustments. This is where we have the ability to make decisions and make adjustments based on the performance that we see in between our trials, as opposed to applying one instruction or rule across many interactions. All right. We can, however, have both types of control, abstractional and instructional, and we can transfer them independently or together. And I think this is a key interaction between the use of instruction and the rationale for performance-based adjustments. Similarly important here is Haze in 1986, Haze et al. They talk about the power of verbal control that suggests that verbal stimuli should not be deliberately used without serious consideration of their long-term effects. The pervasiveness of verbal stimuli would appear to allow rules to exert profound control over human action and impede on the effect of the direct contingencies, which is similar to what we were talking about, where instructional stimuli may in fact override abstractional stimuli or even just direct contingencies that we observe. So we should be mindful of how we teach and what we teach, being sensitive to these different sources of stimulus control and intentionally incorporating strategies to improve staff's ability to make decisions in the moment based on the environment and based on the interaction. We're halfway through. That one was heavy. Bear with me. This next one's a little lighter, all right? So for this next rule or principle here, number 6, we really focus on the individual and group behavior. This one came about in our organizational meetings, and that was focus on the goal more than your role. This was something my boss always said, and in fact was our company motto at one point. I always questioned it, and I was like, wouldn't this be messy if we didn't know what our roles were? But I think I was just being too literal. This was also written to emphasize a message to our staff and to ourselves in regard to our own work, but I think it also plays into our therapeutic relationship with the staff, with our clients, and the consumers we work with. It should be noticed here that the focus is on the goal, and that's more than obstacles, distractions, roles, and rules. But what is a goal? Romero and Turnkey explored this in 2014. Is it extrinsic or intrinsic? Is it in the future? Is it some attentional focus or some evaluative criteria? To have a goal is probably a universal experience in language-abled humans, and the custom of talking about one's goals is a commonplace behavior in everyday conversation. Future goals tend to be ascribed significant value on a personal basis, and goal-oriented behavior almost seems to delineate the complexity of human responding in comparison with that of other species. Behaviorally, we can define this through verbal behavior. Some have defined it through relational frame theory. But either way, our overall goal is overall goal-directed behavior is behavior under the influence of other behavior, verbal behavior for that matter, or rather a specific instance of a statement, a goal statement. These can function as rules, and in other words, antecedents specifying the behavior and the consequence. These functional relationships are under the control of the past and the present context of the listener to the rule, and they may be analyzed in terms of how antecedent and consequential functions of events change as a result of these of the relational respondent. So why is this even important? Goal statements may provide stimulus functions that reduce the likelihood of off-task and counterproductive behavior. Very important for supervisors to consider. In treatment, Romero and Turnkey discussed that they could imply lessening the features of various types of avoidant behaviors just by pointing out the incompatibility between these strategies and the chosen goal. When a goal is defined, not as a mental entity, but as verbal behavior, it readily lends itself to manipulation. Goal talk may not only serve a useful purpose in orienting mutual future behavior in a way that's more likely to reach specified consequences, but it also promotes a sense of communion between those involved. It may foster cohesion in therapeutic work, and ultimately be instrumental in creating a work alliance beyond the outcome. So remember, train the process, not the procedure. This is a variation that spans the same principle to the person, the group, or the organizational level. Verbal statements can be powerful, more powerful than the roles and descriptions that are provided. And these roles may be limiting. Having goals has a power to overcome direct contingencies. So having those goals and having that common interest can be extremely important in overriding direct contingencies that our staff may or parents may be experiencing. This brings up our second code word. Second code word is a plural noun, resources. A plural noun, resources. All right. This next rule, rule number 7, it can be applied in a lot of ways. I focus on it as a productive statement, one to justify our efforts and encourage our staff to push on and parents to keep one doing what they can. Just to note, this can also be used to help shift our focus on the variables we have control of and shift attention to our immediate environment. And that is to do the best you can with what you have. And oftentimes what we have are limited resources. And some related concepts to this rule that I found were problem solving. Chadwell et al. 2019 talked about problem solving from a behavioral perspective and the implications for behavior analysts. Judah Axe in 2018 talks about the empirical evaluations of Skinner's analysis of problem solving, and the pursuit of actual problem solving behavior. While not specifically related to the behaviors of the clinician, this talks about the application of the strategies and perspectives that highlight how we can practice and how we may use these strategies in replicable ways for ourselves and others. As mentioned in the discussion about perspective, being creative and flexible with the variables, information, and resources we have available allows us to solve our problem or intervene on a targeted behavior in various ways. Slocum et al. In 2014 talked about evidence-based practice in applied behavior analysis, which he presented as a decision-making process that integrates the best available evidence with clinical expertise and client values and context. This definition posits evidence-based practice as a pervasive feature of all professional decision-making by behavior analysts with respect to client services. It's not limited to narrowly restricted sets of situations, rules, or decisions. And the definition asserts that the best available evidence should be a primary influence on all decision-making related to the services and should note very specifically the client values and context, which we've talked about a couple of times here. So emphasizing this notion challenges ourselves and those we supervise to continue to observe, assess, and analyze the environment and the observed behaviors to put together new solutions. Constantly challenging ourselves puts us in a better position to respond to the idiosyncrasies of each client, family, and staff, and individually in ways that are more personal and potentially effective. This can allow us to help develop solutions for families without needing to bring in extra materials and encourage us as supervisors to provide more information, resources, and training of our staff. The best they can do is going to be correlated with the resources, direction, and supervision that they've been provided. For number 8, one of my favorite, another one of my favorites, they're all my favorites. I'm lying. I don't have any favorites. But number 8, we have, as I mentioned, we all have limited resources, limited time and energy. We have limited authorization hours, limited funding, limited financial resources, etc. Everything's limited. We should look to use approaches and strategies that will provide us with the best outcomes for its cost. And that is work smarter, not harder. Work smarter, not harder. I will say this principle is extremely applicable. There's a lot of application strategies and ideas here that can be useful. But Gilbert in 2013, in his book Human Competence, wrote this out as a worthy performance equals outcome over resources. And those resources can include time, behavior, or response effort, right? So we want to shift our focus to maximizing our effect. Ways that we can do this include generative instruction and behavioral cusps. right? Programming for this across our consumers may be one way that we can ensure that we're making the most of our efforts. Remember, the more resources it takes away from an effective performance. Right. So we'll start with a quick review of behavioral cusps, right? That leads us to accessing new reinforcers are socially valid, have a level of generativeness, and competes with inappropriate responding, and can affect large numbers of people outside of the person themselves, right? In utilizing behavioral cusps, when selecting your targets in programming, the big four, Eli Rosales talks about communication, play, and leisure, gaining attention, and flexibility and tolerance as four behavioral cusps that we can target in practice as preventative measures, as preventative practice. Specifically, they were talking about in early intervention. But I find this to be extremely relevant for most of the clients that I get, all the way up through young adults. We have to consider the significance, the utilization, and the application of the skill, and more importantly, the return on investment. After all, efficiency is the name of the game because of, as I mentioned, we have lots of limited resources and limitations in general. So what might this look like in practice? Belial, in his article on model-dependent realism, talks about how for every problem, there is a solution, and most solutions are more effective for certain types of problems. So I say we go and look for what works and use it when and where it's appropriate, right? Learn to be creative and flexible, which we've already talked about. Be bold and seek mentorship. That also relates to being humble, right? Knowing your limitations and seeking help when needed. Invest in opportunities with large return on investments, and recognize common elements and draw connections. Don't be complacent. Recognizing opportunities with large return on investments, I think for BCBAs or others, relates heavily to when we seek out CEU opportunities. Sometimes I look for CEU opportunities that are not going to be too limited in their scope, and I look for ones that are going to help me across multiple contexts. And examples of this in practice, these are some that I use and that I have found to be overlapping. The Essential for Living, an assessment for severe to moderate clients, overlaps and goes hand in hand with the interview-informed synthesized contingency analysis and skills-based treatment, or the practical functional assessment developed by Dr. Hanley and his company and his students. Those two go hand in hand. When you're able to utilize the Essential for Living, the approach that you're going to take aligns itself well with the objectives that you're going to be finding in the assessment and in the approach. Rapid Skills Parent Training developed by CBA in Louisville, I believe, and the 7 Steps to Earning Instructional Control both overlap nicely in their delivery of strategies for parents. I use them for staff as well. Sometimes learning how to pair, learning how to provide clear instructions, learning how to reinforce appropriate behavior or use differential reinforcement. All very important behavioral cusps for parents, and it's even for staff. And then for those who practice using the acceptance and commitment therapy, the AIM curriculum, Accept, Identify, Move by Dr. Dixon and his group, and Paolunas, they are, which I think you heard about them earlier this month. And so their curriculum is fantastic for students to learn and apply these concepts, while there is an Act for Parent training manual developed by, I believe it was Gold et al. In 2017 or 16. And so when you use curriculum like this that go hand in hand, you're training teaching children and parents using similar concepts, which is going to help generalization into the home and into their own interactions. And so I always find it very important that we consider not just that we're programming for specific behaviors, but the behaviors and the skills that are going to have large, widespread outcomes for our clients. All right, rule number 9, a little bit heavier of a rule here. I found this to be most useful, rather, as a gut check or a reality slap, if you will, for myself, other supervisors, or staff. The comments, complaints, or lack of enthusiasm have often been an opportunity for me to apply this principle. It's a constant reminder that our success as professionals, as practitioners and collaborators is not a given. This is a constant process we must work on and build constantly. And that is, it is not our right to train, teach, or treat an individual just because we're a professional, just because we have a credential, just because we have a position or we have an authorization, doesn't give us the right to treat or train them. Okay, I've added in an article here that actually focuses on the rights of the individual that we're servicing. Right, they have a right to habilitation or teaching skills needed to live as independently as possible. Bannerman et al. In 1990 discussed the advantages and disadvantages of allowing our clients to develop the skills necessary to exercise personal liberties and the rights to make choices. And this is, while this is more about the rights of the client, it still emphasizes the importance of the team being vigilant in protecting these rights and considerations to ensure that we're incorporating the client's preferences and teaching skills related to decision making with plenty of opportunities for choice. On the flip side, Holbrin in 97 provides us with a historical walkthrough of behavior analysis as it relates to a residential setting. Through our successes and our difficulties and obstacles, many of which were self-inflicted, he then highlights our improvements in being more ethical, protecting the rights of the consumer, and the use of least restrictive and functionally relevant interventions. He champions a person-centered approach where we include the person and those significant others in planning. Professionals tend to listen while family members, friends, and others who spend the most time with the individual have the loudest voice. All right. The process identifies and builds on the person's strengths and capacities. It focuses on the deficits and problems that are outside of the individual in the home, in the day program, the school, the community. They can leave at any time, and this should resonate with us. In a more applied example, something I just mentioned in the last principle, Schramm and Miller, in their book, The 7 Steps of Earning Instructional Control, highlight a very similar message. It's even insinuated in the title. Our instructional cooperation in our therapeutic relationship must be earned. This is an extremely applicable across all of our audience that we've been discussing. Clients, most obviously, parents, we need to earn their respect and earn their trust and meet them where they are. This plays very quickly into our presentation about gaining buy-in. All right. And not to mention, because it's not our right to train or teach, and our past history, I think it's important to bring up our past, our history, right? Some of these words here may make others uncomfortable, but they're all a part of our history and our current concerns. If you Google concerns with ABA, these words will pop up: abusive, coercive, torture, ableism, right? Creating robots or rote learning. These things all pop up. And very recently, the National Council on Independent Living had a vote to potentially ban ABA. And while this slide itself can have its own presentation, I only bring this up as this is a part of our history. It's something that we have to be aware of, something we have to account for in our practice, maybe necessarily own it and do better, right? Hashtag do better, if you will. And that led to this article that also came out this year, Concerns about ABA-based Interventions by Leaf et al. Right, in this article, which is a fantastic read, they dive into the various concerns that they've had and provide an evaluation and recommendations for each one of them. And once again, this principle here is just to bring light to it. It's meant to be a gut check. It's meant to be to have us go back to the drawing board and make sure we are doing right by our client and using what we have, doing the best we can with what we have. Right, that was the principle already. All right, and our final code word, it's a verb, buy, to buy. All right, verb buy. That brings us to our last principle for my final act. This was a rule added with input thanks to a classmate of mine, he who shall not be named Lucas. While up on my soapbox, he told me that I might as well say this directly as a principle. It incorporates everything I've been talking about and serves as another reminder for how we may develop and grow. And that is, we must learn to learn. Learn to learn. I like this picture. Nuringer in 1981, in an article on self-experimentation, says if psychologists applied the scientific method to our own lives, we would learn more of importance to everyone and assist more in the solution of problems than if we continue to regulate science exclusively to the study of others. It's our ethical obligation to stay up with the times. It's in our code of ethics, just to make sure we note it. Passing the exam is a minimum standard in our profession. Our path begins there. If all of these strategies and principles work for our client, they should be good enough for us to use. We have to set up our environment and contingencies to support the increase or at least consistent efforts to learn new material. If you haven't had a chance to read this essay, very awesome, by Dr. Hanley last year, it was released. He talks about today's ABA or perspective on today's ABA. And he starts by asking questions. When we're talking about learning, I like the way he posed the different ways we can learn in practice. And so the first one is learn by listening. In today's ABA, we start with asking questions, listening and learning about the clients by people who know and love them and themselves. Learn by creating joy, by putting together contexts in which others will be happy, relaxed, and engaged, one in which they feel safe and in control. Enrich this space with their favorite activities that they love, and don't be stingy, right? Teach them that you're there for them, that you hear them, and that you're trying to understand them, right? Learn by empowering. The clients are empowered and understand that they do not need to comply against their will and do not need to escalate to escape or avoid things they don't want or obtain things they don't want. We want to teach them that we're there for them. We're trying to understand them even more now, despite sometimes the lack of precision or general acceptability of their communication. We have to gain their trust. And learn while teaching. This places the aim of this treatment process are continually informed by feedback provided by the person, by the client, both in terms of what they say and what they do. The abstractional stimuli, if you will. That which is championed is establishing trust, engagement, authenticity, and agency. Cooperation is shared in shared experiences follows that. Acknowledged in this process is the skills that we will be learned during our therapist, teacher, and parent-led times, as well as during times in which the client is leading. So we've made it through all 10. We're still here. We're going to circle back really quick. All right, I've put them up here. Some really quick closing points here. I hope everyone notices, right? Number 4, 80% presentation, 20% science. Clearly a hyperbole, but this is my example of the 80-20 rule, right? Depending on the audience, right? Maybe it needs to be tailored a little bit more or less for a more general audience or more advanced audience, but it was about a presentation and then 20% science. That was a lot of science in this one. And to go back to the title of this presentation, right? I said, thinking outside the box, question mark. I was presenting this as thinking outside the box to my staff and to my families. And what I've learned is that I'm not thinking outside the box. This stuff has been around. Some of these articles are 50 years old, right? And so I'm not thinking outside the box. I just don't think we're listening, right? These articles continue to come out year after year, talking about very similar topics. And we're continuing to have the same issues. We're continuing to have the same public relation issue as a science, right? So we need to #do better about utilizing the work that has been done, the lessons that have already been learned to make improvements in ourselves, our practice, and our science for others to buy in, to agree with, or to incorporate, or just to be okay with right now, right? Some of our boxes just don't seem to be big enough. We need to open up our boxes and see the bigger picture here, right? And while, I mean, there's something like 50-something articles cited throughout this presentation, it's not expected to everyone to read all of these, but trying to figure out where to start, right? You think big, have a really big goal. We talked about goals here, focus on that goal. Have a goal on improving. Think big, start small, right? Break this down into small, achievable steps. We are behavior analysts after all. Shaping, chaining helps in this process, right? Breaking this down into smaller steps, whether it's readings, whether it's podcasts, whether it's seeking mentorship, or just reading some of these articles. We can all do small little steps towards improving our practice, improving our science, and improving the dissemination of the science to the general audience. Thank you. As I mentioned as well, I would be happy to share a reference page. I've already developed a Word document with all of these, as I think, like I said, I don't want you to leave empty-handed. I'm happy to share that, so you don't actually have to do the digging yourself. I've already done that. But yes, I don't know if there was any questions, Lucas. I'd be happy to take some.
I don't see any in the chat, but if folks have some, feel free to ask them now. We can stay a few moments. And while people are thinking about their questions, I want to thank you so much, Ed. That was a fantastic talk, and I hope those of you on the presentation that are behavior analysts, I hope this sparked some thoughts for you. Those of you who aren't behavior analysts but regularly work with behavior analysts to provide treatment to maybe other people that you support, I hope this sets kind of a model for you on what you should expect from our field, because you have a role to play in helping the field of behavior analysis do better, and the behavior analysts have a role as well to do better. So thank you so much, Ed. That was a fantastic talk. I hope people benefited from it. I love that talk, and it's not just because my name's on the end of it. I didn't do any work. Ed did all the work, but I really liked that talk. It does not look like there are any questions, Ed, so we'll go ahead and close it out here. Everyone, we have a little